This week, we find ourselves listening to what is perhaps Jesus' most famous parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is the Good Samaritan? When I ask my students, without fail, they say, the guy who helps, or a good guy. Virtually everyone, no matter their religious background, knows the story. We all know the story, and yet, in our familiarity, we often perhaps fail to truly hear the parable's call. We don't listen as carefully because we know it so well. Parables, notes the Jewish New Testament scholar A.J. Levine, are meant to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. So with that in mind, we see a scholar of the law challenge Jesus. And who is my neighbor? It always struck me as yet another place where someone seems to simultaneously try to catch Jesus and get Jesus to let him off the hook, kind of like the story of the rich young man. Jesus answers by placing us on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, just after a man has been robbed, beaten, and left for half dead. A priest and a Levite, two devoutly religious men, saw him and passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan, who was at the time not just somebody who was an outcast, Levine tells us, but truly seen as an enemy, was moved with compassion, stops and cares for him. Luke's gospel gives us concrete, practical care offered to the wounded man, including seeking after his long-term recovery, likely using what little money he had for himself for his own journey. On face value, Jesus' message is simple. He ends with, and which of the three were neighbor to the robber's victim? The one who treated him with mercy, the scholar says. And so Jesus says, go and do likewise. My students aren't wrong. The Samaritan is one who helps. But I want to suggest that there's maybe more going on. When we listen to Jesus' parables, it's usually clear who he is targeting and who we are as listeners. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, however, Jesus presents a story in which we're challenged to reflect on where we fit. It is this fluidity, this question of our position, of positionality, that Pope Francis brings out in his recent encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, on social friendship and fraternity. The Jesuits, of which Pope Francis is one, have a common prayer practice called the Examen, where one reflects upon one's day and the presence of God, and where we may be challenged or struggled in that day in our relationship with God. I want to suggest that the parable of the Good Samaritan kind of invites us into almost an examen of discipleship, asking, where am I in this story today? And if we're honest with ourselves, we recognize that at different points in our lives, we inhabit different roles in the story. And so, as I look back on my week, and I invite you to look back on yours, 4 questions I offer to guide us through thinking about our place in the parable. When might I have been like the scholar of the law, looking to avoid seeing someone as my neighbor? It is a call, notes Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti, to acknowledge that we are constantly tempted to ignore others, especially the weak. It's not a condemnation, but a recognition that in humility, we often brush off the needs of others, people and concerns we see as not our problem, outside our circle of concern. Second, when might I have been like the priest and the Levite, so certain that I know what the Lord is asking of me, even as I treat some of my neighbors with indifference? Fratelli Tutti reminds us that belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure we are actually living in a manner pleasing to God. Third, and this for some of us might even be the most difficult to think about, when might I have been the wounded man in need of compassion and care? While all of us will not be attacked, we are all wounded and called to accept our own finitude and vulnerability and interdependence. Are we prepared to accept compassion from someone we see as other, that perhaps we see as our enemy? And finally, when have I seen my brothers and sisters in need, and like the Samaritan, been moved with compassion to truly be a neighbor to others? Gustavo Gutierrez once said in a homily he gave at the Vatican that I have no neighbors naturally. I become neighbor when I leave my path and enter into somebody else's to be in relationship with them. The purpose is not to chastise, but to invite us each into a deeper reflection. In doing so, we're invited to recognize the humility of our own finitude and the limits of our own certainty, to reject indifference and fear, inject the indifference and fear of the bystander, and embrace the compassion and solidarity of the Samaritan. And so, as we think back and we reflect, we find ourselves similarly faced with Moses' call that we heard in the first reading from Deuteronomy, to follow the Lord's commandments, which are not, Deuteronomy tells us, too mysterious or remote, but already very near, in our hearts and in our minds. And yet, you and I have only to carry it out.